Welcome to our first panel, China and the World in 2030. I will be the moderator, and we will have three wonderful panelists. First of all, Laura Alfaro, who will join us online. Unfortunately, on short notice, she eventually couldn't come here, which is a big pity. We miss her. Yeah, who's a professor at HBS, or Harvard Business School, since 1999. She holds a PhD from UCLA and has actual policy experience. She's been a minister of the economy and planning of Costa Rica in 2010 and until 2012. She's a field leader in international finance and international trade, has a very exciting research agenda using rich micro firm level data, rich survey data, I believe some of which we will see today, and increasingly also focused on China. So she's an expert of the panel we're holding today, and I look very much forward to hearing her thoughts. Then we have Bruno Maçães, is that the right pronunciation? Yes, who is an author, politician, and consultant. He holds a PhD in political theory from Harvard University. He then, after graduating, entered academia, but then quickly became a minister of European affairs in Portugal. After this experience, he returned to become an author, to be an author, and has become a leading thinker in the field of geopolitics. He's written several books on China, on Eurasia, that I can strongly recommend, that are provocative and thought-provoking. So I'm a big fan. He has a huge following on Twitter as well, so I can also recommend that, and I very much look forward to your thoughts and to your views. And then we have Guntram Wolff, who just became director of DGAP, the German Council of Foreign Relations, one of Germany's leading think tanks. Before that, he has led Bruegel, the think tank in Brussels, for 10 years, which we were talking about it yesterday with spectacular success, making it one of the most visible think tanks in Europe, in fact, worldwide. So great that you're coming back to Germany to bring some fresh influence and ideas to Berlin, which we severely need. He's one of the leading policy advisors when it comes to geopolitical questions in Europe. And again, I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts. So the way we wanted to structure this today is to start with some opening statements. So we'll first give the floor to Laura, who also has some slides, and then we'll open it up with a couple of guiding questions, and then start with a debate. So Laura, the floor is yours. Thank you for getting up in the middle of the night.
Thank you very much. Again, apologies for not being there. It seems that you're all having a lot of fun. I'm actually a morning person, but fair enough, not necessarily a 4 a.m. person, although by now probably we'll see the sunrise. So let me just give you some thoughts on some work that I have been doing. Let me start by just saying that in general, I do think China's role and globalization has been good in a narrow sense of increasing trade, FDI, and capital flows, but also welfare. As you know, China's integration to the world economy has been the greatest mass reduction in world poverty the world has seen, with also benefits to some other countries. But globalization needs to be managed, and in particular in the north, there is a backlash. And this is the work I have been doing with David Chor from Dartmouth and Maggie Chen, where we have been analyzing the public support on globalization. This is some surveys that we have been doing now for 5 years. Just to give you a sense, this is work since 2018. Every year we have surveyed people, and in general, more than around 60% seem to be consistently against globalization in the sense of limiting imports, and we have asked about some other measures. But the objective really of our work has been to try to change attitudes through research-based facts. And so we have been randomizing treatments in these samples every year, where we have been given information about facts on globalization related to trade hurts, the negative effect of competition from China on manufacturing, but also positive on the effects that it has had on overall employment, in prices, and also the fact that the tariffs hurt in prices and income. And what has been surprising for us is that in the first round that we did, 2018 to 19, perhaps as expected, bad news on jobs led people or moved people to be more against trade. But paradoxically, when we told them good things about trade in terms of jobs, it was not symmetrical. We couldn't get them to support more trade. When we told them that it helped prices, we actually got them to be even more against also globalization. And thus we conducted these surveys every year just to see if there was something to these results. And again, year after year after year, again, for the last 5 years, even going through some unprecedented shocks, we consistently get people to be against trade, even when we tell them good things in terms of jobs and particularly prices. So again, we have been trying to understand these results. We have explored mechanisms. In fact, we directly asked them why they gave us the answers they gave us. And overall, what has been a consistent theme in the word clouds and also in the analysis is overwhelming concern about China, not only as a threat to jobs, but also as national security and in general, the economic role of China. Again, in terms of jobs, prices, and even when we mentioned them that the tariffs hurt the economy, we asked them why, and they would directly tell us because we don't want to trade with China. And so again, it does seem that any management of globalization in the US, and again, this is a trend mostly in the North, this backlash we have not yet seen in many countries in the South, does need to come with a discussion of the bilateral relation US-China. And the question is, does it matter? And I ask this because we have seen some reevaluation of global value chains. Firms have been trying to get out of China before the pandemic, even mostly in terms of cost, but also the trade war. We have also seen governments with actions against this dependence. But as we argue in another paper, not all of these global chains are so easy to nearshore or reassure. And this is work that I'm doing with Harold Fadinger and Jan Schmidt, where we're particularly looking at rare elements. As you know, they're not as rare, they're just very hard to mine. And they are at the core of most of what we have called this new wave of globalization. Technology is in everything computers, but also is in everything electric turbines. And so, again, they play a big role and they're disproportionately being produced in China. As you know, some of these rare elements really do not have a substitute. And so in particular, in terms of electric, as you know, mining is concentrated in China, but the different parts of the production chain, again, concentrated in China. And so what is interesting, and again, this is probably speaking more about Europe and Germany, that they might be exchanging one source, one country of energy to another source, one country of energy. Even when I was in government, the role of diversification of supply and energy was in the table, even in a small little country like Costa Rica. And again, I do think that this has broader implications in how we not only think about globalization, but also how we fight climate change. EU, in the Economist Intelligence Unit, has also been reporting that inside China, companies also have been worried about retaliation. So in general, again, concerns about the growth in China, but more generally also implications about globalization. And let me just end with this slide that we can retake later, something about concerns going forward in terms of their growth, the different profiles of their age population. But let me end here.
shoot out the first question. Okay. So thanks a lot, Laura. Very fascinating agenda. One way to structure this would be to think about key questions out there, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts. And one obvious question is like, is China still rising? Right? Is the current trouble in the real estate sector with Belt and Road and other areas where China's struggling with, is that a hiccup on a way up? Or put more provocatively, will this be a Chinese century or not? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
All right, so that's a really big question. My inclination is to look at the broad structural trends, which I think do favor China, and not to be so fixated on the news from last week or last month or even last year. If you look at the story of America's rise from the end of the Civil War until the First World War, it was punctuated by lots of devastating financial crises that happen every 8 years. And that was actually the steps in the ladder through which the US rose to world supremacy. And I think that it's inevitably part of the process if you're going through fast growth and transformational growth of the kind the US had and the kind that China has. That's my general framing as I look at some of these news, which doesn't mean that China will not face significant troubles, and it doesn't mean that policy mistakes are not being made. I think COVID policy is one where everyone is very puzzled. Everyone I talk to, companies, I've had companies tell me, we thought we understood China, we thought they were pragmatic, we thought they knew how to deal with problems, and what's happening now just overturns all those assumptions. So we see what happens, but the fundamental structural trends, the ability that China has, and you can see on the ground if you travel to China or live there, in terms of transforming its economy, upgrading the technological content of manufacturing, I think that's still progressing. I think the news from, for example, what's happening with chips are broadly consistent with this narrative. And I think also the regime has shown some ability to self-correct. That is the story in the past. We'll see now with COVID and other problems. But the picture globally is one where it's a little bit of a last man standing because everyone is facing significant troubles. And you also have to place China's troubles in that context. But to conclude, there's this discussion, for example, on whether China will ever overtake the US in terms of total GDP. And I've seen even people make bets, and sometimes scholars and analysts make bets about this. And I'm very puzzled by that because, I'll take any bet that in my lifetime China will overtake the US because it just seems, if you look at the population dynamic, it's not a judgment about the regime or the value of liberal democracy. It's just a judgment about population and growth dynamics, that China is 4 times larger than the US, and therefore you would have to have a GDP per capita lower than 1/4 of the US in order not to overtake the size of the American economy. And looking at the dynamics in China, that seems inevitable. It's a relevant point to make because obviously when it comes to defense spending and a country's ability to project power abroad, what matters is total GDP. It's not GDP per capita. For some of the things that we're interested in geopolitics, GDP per capita is actually not that relevant. So overall, to answer your question directly, I would think that by 2030, we'll still be talking about China's rise, and we'll probably, by that time, be trying to see exactly when the moment will happen when Chinese GDP will overtake the US GDP. A relevant moment. In a book I wrote about America recently, there was a lot of talk in 1891 about the moment when the US would overtake the UK, and so that's not new, this sort of discussions.
Well, so I guess we are supposed to have a debate, so let me take the opposite view. Not just for the case of the debate, but let me give you a couple of arguments why I think that China's growth potential is often overestimated in foreign policy circles. I mean, as economists, we tend to think about growth as, you know, really being driven by sort of three factors: capital, labor, and of course technological progress. And when you look at those, and you start with capital, I mean, you will see that China basically ran a saving and investment rate of 40 to 50% over several decades, and a lot of the capital investment, especially since sort of the 2008-9, has increasingly been put into infrastructure and housing, so basically into concrete. And the question is this going to be the right growth model going forward, given the relatively high capital to labor ratio that China already has? And I think the answer is probably not. So I don't think capital and the saving and investment model that China pursued certainly in the last 10-15 years is going to be the driver of growth for China in the next 10 or 15 years, or it's going to be a sustainable driver of growth. I mean, of course, you can still continue buying, building bridges, but you know that's not really sustainable, and it drives up your debt ratio without much productivity effects. Now comes the second factor, labor. So if we think about labor, China has benefited over decades from basically absorbing rural labor into the city working population. But it is also now, if you look at the demography of China at the moment, where actually working age population is starting to shrink, and so all the demographic benefits and the labor mobility benefits seem to also come to an end. And so to me, the really crucial question, therefore, remains the last one, right? I mean, to what extent is technology, technological progress, etc., total factor productivity, or however you want to call it, to what extent is that going to be a driver, and how much can the government really push that factor upwards? And you know, I just read a nice little note by Michael Pettis, who is an economist. I think is he still in Beijing? Actually, I don't know. He's probably still in Beijing. And you know, he has expressed, to my mind, quite rightly, a certain skepticism around the ability of the government to really push the high-tech sector. And his argument is basically that you know, the one factor that the Chinese government can relatively easily redirect is availability of capital, but capital is already fully available to the relatively small high-tech sector. So there's a high-tech sector of some 10% or so of GDP, but that sector has enough capital. So it's not capital that constrains that sector. So the question is, what can you really do as a government to nurture and grow that sector so that it starts generating much more growth? And you know, there I guess we can debate technology policy and the extent to which Made in China 2025, etc., will be a success 10 or 15 years down the road. But I think this is really the crucial question: to what extent will this be driven? Perhaps my last point. There is, of course, also, and that's an option that some economists tend to think about, is well, can the growth model be rebalanced from investment to consumption? And you know, there, I guess my question would be, and there I'm not deep enough into sort of domestic Chinese politics, but my question would be, to what extent can the government, and especially the local governments, accept a significant transfer of resources from their own control to basically households that would drive that consumption? I mean, this is not just about transferring significant resources, it's really also about transferring, to some extent at least, political power that goes along with these resources. So my view is there will be really a lot of hiccups. It will not be easy at all for China. Now, will the mega trend, and I'm not going to weigh in on whether China is going to be bigger than the US. I guess it will be, but of course, a lot depends really on this total factor productivity growth differential between the US and China. And what we see at the moment is, of course, that the US has a fairly high TFP growth, fairly high productivity growth. It's still at the frontier in many, many technologies. Well, I mean, I guess we shall see. It's very difficult for economists to give predictions, and that's why I'm sort of just giving some arguments in the other direction also to stimulate our debate.
Laura, you want to come in on that one?
I mean, that's why I put this slide. When one sees this slide, one sees a couple of things, that the growth that was reallocation of labor and capital that was mentioned, but a concern going forward. Not only because of this, the fact that they have this age profile that no other country has seen transition this fast, but also because they have not been successful in changing it. So again, it does speak of the limits of a growth strategy that has been about forcing reallocation of resources, and the difficulty of the next stage that is about combining these resources efficiently. Whether it's going to overtake the US, I agree, there is a little bit of 1.3 billion people is destiny, and so it might be. But having 1.3 billion people without the GDP per capita, it's a problem. And again, I do think this imbalance, they know, will come back to haunt. And as I said, they have not been successful in changing this. I just don't see people also wanting to have a lot of kids in the current situation. So it is a problem that is going to affect their long-term prospects.
All right, so Bruno, seems like you're in the minority here. So we see that, I guess.
So that's the difference between economists and...
So population is aging. It won't come from the labor, as Guntram and Laura are saying. The infrastructure growth model, to some degree, has reached its limit or is maybe broken. So we have to bet everything on technology. Is that? I mean, where does your optimism come from specifically?
I mean, I think it is true that the model has kind of reached the dead end. I do see awareness of that all across policy circles in Beijing. When I lived there a couple of years ago, this was what they talked about, with some elements of self-criticism. Guntram is correct, and Michael Pattis has written a lot about this, that the real question here is to what extent the politics allows for a correction. To what extent there has to be democratization elements that go along with a shift to consumption. That's a question mark that I have myself, because obviously one reason that consumption is so depressed is that it fits with the political model of state-directed economy, geared toward exports and keeping labor costs low. By the way, that is also a problem in Germany that we're seeing. So this is not unique to China. Now, I do think that what China is doing is trying to overcome the middle income trap and do that at scale. Is there another example of a country this large that was successful doing that? Perhaps not. And so it's not surprising that it will turn out to be difficult. And I have no doubts that we'll be talking about serious economic crisis. I think, as Michael Pattis says, maybe they will not take the form of a financial crisis because the system is different. They will take the form of a drastic slowdown of economic growth. That we're already seeing, perhaps this year only slightly above 3%. But that is, I think, part of the growth pains. And as a general note, I think that should be seen probably more as a positive sign than as a negative sign. That the regime, for example, has accepted this year that growth is going to be lower. And that already indicates a certain dissatisfaction with the current model and a sense that the current model cannot continue on the same terms. So I'm just, I think we're looking at the same facts. I'm just, as a non-economist, trying to place them in a broad historical, sociological framework, where I see a country that is very driven and mobilized around this idea of becoming the largest economy in the world. And I see a regime that, for all the criticisms we make in other areas, when it comes to policy making, one of the things that surprised me in Beijing was the extent and depth of debates about policy making, where, meetings like this, people would talk about exactly what we're talking about here. The model has failed, we need to change the model. So it's not the Soviet Union in that sense that people, as we heard before, the people are committed to this model and will not change no matter what. If that were the case, then I would be agreeing more with Guntram in particular.
Great, thanks. So I guess there is kind of a consensus that China will continue to grow to some extent, that it will continue to play a major role. So we are, in some way, we are living and will continue to be living in a more multipolar world, and then the extent of the strength of the US versus China, we will see. But in this more multipolar world, as economists, what can we expect when it comes to globalization? So is this rise of China and the shift towards multiple centers of power, is this good news or bad news for globalization? Will we see an intensification of global trade, say, a competition for Africa that leads kind of a race to the top? Or rather, will we see more like a Cold War, post-World War II area where we have like a kind of balkanization of global trade and financial markets into spheres of interest? So what is your view on kind of the future of globalization in this new international order? Maybe Guntram, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think basically it can be both, right? I mean, we don't know which one, but let me perhaps first highlight some of the upsides. I mean, China's Belt and Road Initiative, which was very negatively seen in the West, in Europe, etc., of course, has major positive effects on globalization, right? I mean, if you build an airport in a place where there hasn't been an airport, it increases connectivity. It boosts trade. If you build a ship, a harbor, of course, that also boosts trades. So all these infrastructure measures that China implemented around many countries, I do think they were actually boosting globalization and trade. Now, they came with some conditions as regards direction of trade, and in that sense, there has been perhaps also some, and I think that was also differently implemented in different countries. But we know that if it comes along with trade agreements that are quite exclusive, then you also have trade diversion effects, right? So you can have both. But the infrastructure part should be in principle beneficial for trade. Now, I guess for me the key question sort of going forward is less so how much do we trade in general, but how do we manage excessive risks and dependencies on specific suppliers. And that's where I think the debate in Europe certainly needs to be. It needs to be not about autarky, decoupling from China, etc., because of geopolitical risks. It needs to be about how do we manage big concentrated risks. So what are those big concentrated risks? I think, Laura, you put up already some charts on sort of rare earth and other supplies where supplies are extremely concentrated. You can mention solar panels. I mean, solar panels are very much driven. Global solar panel supply is very much driven by China at the moment. I think the number is something like 85% or so comes from China globally. So there's these quite concentrated risks that it seems to me need to be looked at, and where we don't need to say we stop buying, but we need to be sure that if there was a disruption, we need to have alternative supply routes, and I just discussed that actually over coffee with Kai Conrad. I mean, it's not the fact that we bought gas from Russia that brought us in the crisis. It's the fact that we didn't have liquid LNG terminals in the North Sea that basically meant we were stuck with this one supplier, right? So we need to have alternative supplies, alternative supply possibilities. But we don't need to necessarily decouple from suppliers which are actually cheaper. So I would basically manage it that way going forward. But overall, again, I think a lot depends, of course, how the geopolitical confrontation will play out. If there was a big geopolitical confrontation around Taiwan or whatever, of course, that has big implications also for globalization. But I think at this stage, I would probably say it's more an upside, the China's integration into the world for global trade integration, than a downside.
Laura, do you think we're ahead of a new golden era of globalization, or more on the downside?
So, as I said, I think the past has been great, but we need to rethink a little bit where we're heading. As I mentioned, there is a backlash against globalization. It's mostly in the North. A colleague at Harvard Business School, Meg Rittmer, has written about this, that there is this backlash of this interdependence of economic integration and security concerns. And you see it already playing out in the US. The new package that has been used to try to push technology, chips, energy, has this clause that it has to be produced within the US, which basically means that no one's going to get a subsidy to buy a electric car, as opposed to the position that the Europeans have taken. But that does mean that any subsidy you give is a subsidy that is going to China. I think here, Toyota has been very vocal about that we do need alternative sources of technology. I do think their model of going hybrid was the way to go, but it seems that a lot of pressure groups are trying to push towards this radical EV that does have the implication that we're going to be stuck sourcing materials from China in a world that has become tense. And again, the tension is not coming only from the West, and in particular the North, but also from China, that has reacted to these threats also by becoming more, if you want, by limiting a lot of the role of the private sector and becoming and having the state have a bigger say than it used to be, for example, 20 years ago. So I do think there's going to be a fragmentation. We're going to have to rethink some of these global value chains and technology. On your point of the infrastructure, again, there is still no backlash in the South, but Christoph has written a lot about this with Carmen, and there does seem to be a backlash in a lot of these infrastructure projects that didn't have proper evaluation and not necessarily were given returns. For the moment, China has been just restructuring some of these debts, but this may also come back to haunt us. The economic situation worldwide becomes a little bit more tense. But just to summarize, I do think we're going to see a fragmentation going forward.
Bruno.
I think I'm going to disagree with Laura again. I'm not doing it on purpose. No, I think, you know, there's a lot of talk about decoupling and the end of globalization, but then when you look at the figures, it doesn't look like that. Every quarter, record numbers of Chinese exports to the US. I was just in Canada. People there took me to visit the construction of an LNG terminal in British Columbia that is going to serve China with Canadian LNG, while Canada is still not equipped to export LNG to Europe. And I even asked people, is there a problem with this? And they said, no, of course not. The difference between chips and an LNG terminal is that everyone can see the LNG terminal is purely transparent, so we don't have a problem with that. Canadian authorities don't have a problem with that. American authorities don't have a problem with that. So there's a lot of trade happening. What I do see happening is a sort of different concept of globalization. That liberal globalization, where you have, let us say very briefly, you have universal rules, the rules of the road, as President Biden calls them, and that everyone follows the same rules and we accept the same model, and political power somehow retreats, and it's the private sector that takes the lead. That model is in crisis, I think, and you have a much more geopolitical or geoeconomic globalizations. And the difference is that state actors are also engaged in the project of changing the rules and competing against each other to determine what the final shape of the system will be. And we've lost that naivete of thinking that spontaneously, the final shape of the system will emerge spontaneously from market processes. We now know that the final shape of the global system will emerge from this intense geopolitical competition, and one model will win, or there will be some hybrid compromise. But I think that's the difference. What I would call it is not decoupling, it's a form of industrial policy on a global scale, that the shape of the market is being determined by political actors, and they're engaged in an intense competition between them. In my book on the Belt and Road, I describe an exchange I had with a Chinese official, where he says, and that has stayed with me, that exchange, where he says the Belt and Road is the first example of global industrial policy. And then he even explained, and I think very aptly, that in the European Union, we used to have industrial policy, and when we moved to the European level, we abandoned industrial policy because we concluded it could only work at the national level. The Chinese gambit, let us call it that, is that you can actually shape the global economy as a whole in a form of global industrial policy. And increasingly the US feels like this as well. And so they're engaged in the same competitive process, not to abandon globalization, but to shape globalization rather than leaving the final shape to the market.
Thanks. So let's do one final round of questions and we can open up to Q&A. So Bruno, what you just said, fascinating. I mean, we might enter a new era of globalization, which is highly geopoliticized, that works under great power rivalry conditions. And to some degree, that's going back to historical norm. I mean, the first era of globalization before World War I was one in which wars were around the corner all the time, and yet there was intense trade and financial globalization going on. And it seems we've lost the tools, we lost our ability to cope with this kind of setting. We're certainly behind in Germany, we're certainly behind to some degree also in Europe. So what are the tools, what are the institutions we need to prepare for this new era of high geopolitical competition? What should Germany, what should, we have several policymakers in the room, and I know several have joined us online. So what should Berlin, what should Paris do, what new institutions are needed to cope with this and prepare us better? Yes, Guntram, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, look, what tools and institutions, I mean, it's sort of the way you frame it, you immediately push institutions, right? And so I mean, I guess the first question, is it really institutions, or is it much more domestic action, and if so, what kind of domestic action? And you know, there it seems to me one key issue we need to really focus on is who should act and who should support the action. And I guess to the German debate specifically, I would say now is the moment for the policy-making system to tell business, don't expect that under every circumstance of geopolitical confrontation, you will be bailed out for your profits and exposures that you have to China. Meaning, put it differently, tell our companies that, well, they need to factor in these risks and potential disruptions. And they need to understand that if they make 50% of their profits on the Chinese market, you know, that's their profits that they make, but it's also their risk that they make. So there's a very sort of liberal liberal view, but I think it's a view basically focusing on the responsibility of firms. Now, going beyond the firms, I do think that firms on their own cannot capture all the externalities that there are in supply chains, in interactions, etc. And so in that sense, I'm actually in favor of an industrial policy debate in Europe. And I think, Bruno, you mentioned the Chinese official. I think that is indeed an issue that the European Union has sort of abandoned industrial policy at the national level because of the single market and because there was no European level really being able to do it. And that debate is now ongoing for a few years, how to recalibrate that. And I have to say, I think we as economists, I think we are really not very good in advising in that space. We don't really have clear concepts. We know what doesn't work, and I think a lot of what we hear from the capitals certainly isn't very convincing. Yeah, I mean, there's sometimes billions poured into specific issues. I don't know, chip factory in some place or whatever, while millions are missing in basic research or even education. And so there is a question of how to prioritize here from a political system point of view. But certainly, it seems to me this industrial policy debate is quite central. Third point I want to make quickly on the response is I do think we need to think actively, much more proactively about trade agreements with all kinds of places around the world, because trade, and there I guess, Laura, is interesting. It will be interesting to hear from you, because of course trade is not so popular among many, and trade agreements are not so popular in many parts of our societies. My impression is still that in Europe, attitudes are somewhat less negative than in the US, and I also think that the European debate is a little bit more nuanced than the US debate on trade agreements. But still, even in Europe, it's actually quite difficult to push through trade agreements. But as a society, it seems to me we need to get ready to accept that there are hard trade-offs. I mean, if we don't want to do trade, if we want to limit our exposures to China, etc., I mean, all of a sudden, well, that means prices are going to rise because we're going to have more expensive imports and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, what is it that as a society that we want? Do we want free trade? Do we want free trade and low inflation? I mean, to sort of push it a bit, do we want free trade and low inflation, or do we want high inflation and less trade? I don't know. I mean, so these are sort of the big kind of debates that we need to lead in our societies at this stage.
Great, Laura.
Yeah, so just a comment on definitions. If we're going into a world where there's more national security, there is more industrial policy, I do see that as a world relatively less globalized, because the previous phase of globalization was one of more, if you want, market forces. Fragmentation doesn't mean we're not going to trade. It's just that we are going to reallocate to whom and how we're trading. From the work we have been doing, and again, from political discourse in the US, the US is trying to limit some of that exposure to China. From the work we have done, it does seem to be that people are willing to accept certain costs in prices and trade because of that national security concern. And again, this started in the previous administration, but the current administration doesn't seem to be deviating in terms of that. So at least in the US, I do see that there is some trying to move away from that relation. And as you have mentioned, I do think that as economists, we perhaps are not best equipped to get a view on whether that is correct or not, because it is about, if you want, political and world domination. From a point of view of diversified sources of inputs, I actually do think the US is correct here. I do think it is a big risk to be so dependent on one country and one product, as you guys have seen, whether it's lack of infrastructure, so on and so forth. But it is not a position that I think the US has decided it wants to be and is trying to get away from it. I do have to say, though, that if the world is becoming more industrial policy and national security, we do need to keep in mind that we moved away from that, perhaps for ideology, but also because we found out it was not giving us efficiency. And so if the concern in China is that they need to also go to a growth development strategy about efficiency, that also questions how fast they can be able to go there. Governments may be good at many things, but it's hard to argue that the private sector is not better at coming up with certain type of innovations and certain forms of efficiency. And as I said, there are certain things that are very hard to command. And so we also need to be careful in terms of, if we do think we're all going to go there, the view that we have in terms of growth and efficiency going forward.
Great, thanks. Bruno.
I'll be very quick to leave time for questions. So I think we're all trying to find a way to make this new geopolitical moment compatible with something like global trade and global economic exchanges. That's the challenge. And I think there are ideas in Brussels on how to do this, and you can discuss how realistic they are. There are, I think, fewer ideas in Beijing and Washington, where the assumption seems to be that at the end there will be a winner and the loser will accept that they are the losers, which seems to be implausible, that either the US or China will accept a subordinate place in the world economy at the end of a long process. So I see a bit more clarity in Brussels, where people are actually looking for a way to protect globalization from politics. I also, let me finish this, I also like Guntram's idea that we can use that concept of moral hazard here. You know, there are geopolitical risks, and let companies deal with that. I was surprised to see, let me say as a way to finish, that Uniper has on its website from 2018 or 2019 a great praise of Nord Stream 2. It is praised as the future, as the way to create prosperity and stability in Europe, with a few lines attacking the Americans for daring to criticize Nord Stream 2 and for thinking that LNG is the future of energy in Europe. And this is signed by the CEO of Uniper. It's still there. It hasn't been deleted. I'll credit them with that. But then you get to 2022, and suddenly Uniper is asking for a few billion, and all that seems normal when they have it on their website that they made a big gamble on Nord Stream 2, you know, the gamble didn't pay off, but now they want a few billion from the public budget. And as someone who was involved in the Eurozone crisis, and we kept hearing at the time how moral hazard is such a terrible thing, you would have expected that the debate in Germany would have been that we don't save Uniper because they made their own bets and they should pay for them. But that has not happened. But I agree with Guntram that this is perhaps a way to actually make geopolitics and globalization compatible. Let companies deal with those risks and pay for them when they make the wrong bets.
Great, let's take some questions from the audience. Wolff, please.
Well, thank you. I would be interested in a question to the panel with respect to the boundaries, to the spatial boundaries of China. This is not the same as limits to growth. The Russian narrative is where Russians live, there is Russia. Can we say the same for China? We have 100 million overseas Chinese. And these people are not tourists. These are businessmen. Are they influenced from the Chinese government? Does the Chinese government has a grip on these companies? Are these companies maybe the source of economic growth? Maybe not on GDP, but on GNP for China. So how do we deal with these Chinese overseas businessmen in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and all places where we expect growth rates to be much higher than, say, in other countries?
Collect a few more.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to ask, so if we allow for a global industrial policy, if we don't also need a global competition policy? And what does that mean when you look at the World Trade Organization and the political dysfunctionality that is there, which is also a result of this power competition? So I think there's an impact on a political level that does impact in the medium or long term also the economic side of things, where we were hearing that all in all, overall, the impact of China is positive. But I think that this aspect of political dysfunctionality in terms of what kind of policies we're able to enact on a global scale has to be factored into account.
Microphone. May I ask a question? There's a question to Bruno. There's a lot of criticism for Nord Stream 2. And the question for me is always, was it a mistake to create this infrastructure, or was it a mistake not to create other opportunities to import natural gas to Germany? So is the creation of this opportunity to get cheap gas from Russia, is that the mistake? Or is the mistake not to create alternative supplies? It's a very short question.
One last. Thank you. So it's also a question for to Bruno. Actually, two questions. One is, I mean, you put things in a broad historical context, not saying that there's nothing new under the sun, in the sense that there was a similar debate as to whether the UK would overtake the US back 100 years ago. My question is this the right historical analogy? Can't we think, let's say, of others? Like, let's say in the 50s, you had the debate as to whether the Soviet Union would overtake the US by the time when they launched Sputnik. In the 80s, you had the debate as to whether Japan would overtake the US when they bought the Rockefeller Center. And I wonder whether those two could be also potential analogies, in the sense that they could help us make sense of whether there is a risk that the contradiction in China's development model could actually become very visible right now. That's the first question. It's a symphony.
Battle is over.
I guess they agree with me, you know? It's the trumpet of triumph. The second one is, it's on the role of institutions. So I think you said that the current political system was very alert about what's going on and ready to adapt. And I read many other scholars saying that, in fact, the current political system could be actually an obstacle to adapting the Chinese economy to the knowledge economy, to a culture of innovation and change. So I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more as to why you see it as an asset rather than an obstacle.
Okay, well, very last, Nancy.
Hi, thanks for the great discussion. So I wanted to touch upon this point that you guys all mentioned about the future of Chinese GDP and how the population may or may not change. I think Laura was emphasizing this. So, you know, in the World Economic Forum, they were talking about this report. So a team from Shanghai estimates Chinese population to be down to 587 million by 2100, right? And the U.S. Census Bureau is estimating that the U.S. population is going to be across the 400 million threshold around 2050. I mean, the exact estimate is like 487 million or something like that by 2058. I mean, these estimates are noisy, but the point is that at some point in this century, they're going to cross, right? So another way of asking this question of whether Chinese GDP is going to be bigger than the US or the same, we can just ask, given that they're going to cross, is there any reason to think that per capita GDP is going to, you know, multiply by like 4 to 6 times, right? And again, like, we can be very generous in how noisy we think these estimates are.
Why don't you pick and choose? I mean, starting with the same round before, Guntram, then Laura, and then Bruno.
Well, I mean, many questions I think were for Bruno, but just to say on, just to say, and I guess that is a reflection of having mostly economists in the room, but okay, I mean, just on this global industrial policy point and the global competition policy point, I mean, I mean, of course, theoretically, I guess you're right, but of course we're not going to get that. And the question is, and that's perhaps where the institutional point becomes relevant, the question is, to what extent are our institutions, such as the WTO and others, to what extent have they become completely obsolete and non-functioning? And to what extent do they actually still serve a purpose? And at least allow the settlement of some of those conflicts in some organized way. And I think there is certainly, from my point of view, and I worked a lot with my dear friend André Sapir, who is a sort of a big multilateralist and a big fan, has published a wonderful book on Princeton University Press with Petros Mavroidis on China and the WTO, where he takes basically the optimistic case and says, well, there is actually still scope for the WTO, and these are the things we need to do to manage that part of globalization. But how realistic it is and how much you will really achieve with that, I think people can have divergent views on this, and perhaps I'm certainly much more skeptical than André and Petros have been. So that's perhaps on the institutional point. On the population point, I mean, I haven't seen this very stark number that you just mentioned, but I do think the population issue is I mean, it's not just the overall population size, it's the working age population. And, really working age population is starting to shrink. And, that matters. And that matters also for dynamism of economies. I mean, it's sort of interesting when Japan had this big housing bubble and then the very long period of recession and stagnation afterwards. Well, it was exactly at the moment where basically working age population started to shrink. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not sure it's causality, but at least there's a correlation here that at least I think is noteworthy and could be explored further. On the political model, perhaps there I'm actually with Bruno. I mean, yes, I think the last years under President Xi, there were some issues that were apparently very difficult for internal correction to work, including the zero COVID policy. But on the whole, I mean, from my visits to Beijing, I did observe also quite a lot of policy debate and actually a very high level of knowledge. And I think one issue we certainly need to reflect upon as Europeans is how much do we know about what's going on in the policy circles in Beijing, and how much do they actually know about what's going on here? And the asymmetry of information is just absolutely mind-boggling and staggering. I mean, China knows what we are debating, and not just China. I mean, many people in China know it, and they know it in very, very great detail. We basically have a very rudimentary view of what's going on in the debate within this Chinese Communist Party and the political system in China. So in that sense, I'm a little bit less pessimistic on the political model. I think they have capacity to really self-correct. Okay.
At HBS, we have a group of political scientists, and I have learned that when all these questions come, it's best to leave the political science to the political scientists. So let me just, some broad points. I do think the demographic transition is something to be worried about because, again, we have seen examples of demographic transition. It was mentioned Japan, Europe, so on. But we have never seen at this level, this dramatic, in a country that was still middle income. The other countries, when they had the transition, they were rich, and it's dramatic. And I do think it's going to affect a lot of the things they can and will do. In fact, it is possible that they have this zero COVID policy because of this transition. It is also the fact that it's not only that the vaccine doesn't work that well, it's that they never took it. But also they do have a very vulnerable population in terms of working age, and that they are worried about the implications. So this, I don't think is trivial. And as I said, they have not been able to manage it because this is not as easy to manage. Every country that has gone through this transition and then tells their people, go have kids, they have realized it's not so easy. And if you think about it, why on earth are you going to have many kids if the prospects in the future are becoming more complex? And also it's an economy where you have to put a lot of income into your kids for them to be successful. So I do think this is something to think about. And the other point on the international institutions, I do think we're going to have them. I don't think they're going to go away. It is one of those things that when we get rid of them, someone will invent them. So they have a feature that self-creates them. But we also have to acknowledge that they have been successful when the main players have wanted them to be successful. And this be Europe or the US. We cannot deny China is a big player and it will continue to be a big player. But if China doesn't want to play by the rules, there's nothing that any country can force them. And as I mentioned, the backlash has been mostly in the north. The south, and we saw it also in the reaction to the Russian war, have just decided to find a way to continue their activities. And so they will continue to find a way to perhaps please the West, but continue to trade with China. So that also questions how functional these institutions can be if the big players don't want them for them to play.
Bruno.
Let me try to be quick, but there's three questions I wanted to address. First, Nord Stream 2. I broadly agree with you. I think this has a long history going back to the 50s. Once Europe no longer had colonial empires, and once the US in 1956 told Europeans in very clear terms that we could not have control over the energy routes from the Middle East, Russia appeared as an obvious alternative. It was difficult to avoid. In some respects, it was a product of American policy, by the way. And so we shouldn't be surprised that Russian energy would play a role. But during the 70s and 80s, when these things were discussed, and by the way, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken wrote his undergraduate thesis at Harvard about this, about pipeline politics in the 80s. And you read that story, the book is available on the internet, don't have to buy it even. If you don't want to. But if you read that story, you realize that one of the conditions the US imposed at the time was that Europeans would not exceed 20% of dependence on Russian energy, on their total energy imports. And that over time was just forgotten. By 2013, Germany was up to 40% of total gas imports coming from Russia. And then, incredibly, in the 10 years from 2013 to now, it rose from 40% to very close to 60%. Why did this happen? Because that is the question, I think. If it had stayed at 20%, we certainly would not have this problem. I don't have the position that it is immoral to get a particle of gas from Russia. I do think it is imprudent, to say the least, to allow 60% of your total gas imports to come from Russia after Crimea. There's a debate that I'm surprised is not happening to the extent it should in Germany. The question of U.S.-China GDP, I just don't agree with this view, which seems to be so popular, but I think every economist must find it very puzzling, that there's a value judgment here. That, let us say, if China has a GDP higher than Malta or Luxembourg, there are democracies, that sometimes that's an indictment of democracy. It's just about the numbers. And we have to see demography. I don't believe in those predictions that the two lines will cross. By the way, the US is having a demographic crisis as well. It's very recent. But if you look at last year's numbers, actually for the first time in American history, total population has fallen. And I don't see the US embracing immigration, which was the reason American population was growing. So
they might not be embracing it, but they're coming. Yes.
That's right, but let's see after 2024 if that continues. So I think it's just about the numbers and not about a value judgment here. And sometimes, let me say this, we tend to look at the debate with sort of these lenses that only see the negatives in China. Why are we not discussing inflation and how it's become this intractable problem in the US and Europe? In Europe, really intractable, I think. And in China, it's not there. So it's an advantage, but we tend to overlook that. And finally, very quickly, I like the idea of global competition policy. And by the way, I think that's what the EU is doing or trying to do. And it's not surprising because it is almost a religion in Brussels, competition policy. But this idea that, for example, you have a tool against economic coercion, that when China applies economic coercion, you respond back, and that has a deterrent effect. And therefore, you can actually create a global framework, starting in Brussels, that limits political interference with the economy. I think it's a really exciting idea, and it's an area where we should have really high praise for Brussels, because it's both thoughtful and it's bold, because it's actually a way to try to shape the global system, do it unilaterally. You know, the other two main actors are not interested in this, but let's try to actually impose this from our end, having relative success so far, but I think that's precisely what the EU is trying to do, and not doing it so much at the WTO level, but actually trying to do it more or less unilaterally, but believing that the other state actors will have to follow to some extent.
Thank you so very much for this wonderful debate. So let's give a big round of applause to the panelists.